First Part, Chapter 4, of Essay on the Creative Imagination. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay on the Creative Imagination by Théodule Ribot. First Part, Analysis of the Imagination, Chapter 4, The Organic Conditions of the Imagination. Whatever opinion we may hold concerning the nature of the unconscious, since that form of activity is related more than any other to the physiological conditions of the mental life, the present time is suitable for an exposition of the hypotheses that it is permissible to express concerning the organic basis of the imagination. What we may regard as positive, or even as probable, is very little. 1. First, the anatomical conditions. Is there a seat of the imagination? Such is the form of the question asked for the last 20 years. In that period of extreme and closely bounded localization, men strained themselves to bind down every psychic manifestation to a strictly determined point of the brain. Today, the problem presents itself no longer in this simple way. As at present we incline toward scattered localization, functional rather than properly anatomical, and as we often understand by center, the synergic action of several centers, differently grouped according to the individual case, our question becomes equivalent to: are there certain portions of the brain having an exclusive or preponderating part of the working of the creative imagination? Even in this form, the question is hardly acceptable. Indeed, the imagination is not a primary and relatively simple function like that of visual, auditory, and other sensations. We have seen that it is a state of tertiary formation and very complex. There is required, then, 1. That the elements constituting imagination be determined in a rigorous manner, but the foregoing analysis makes no pretense of being definitive. 2. That each of these constitutive elements may be strictly related to its anatomical conditions. It is evident that we are far from possessing the secret of such a mechanism. An attempt has been made to put the question in a more precise and limited form, by studying the brains of men distinguished in different lines. But this method, in avoiding the difficulty, answers our question indirectly only. Most often, great inventors possess qualities besides imagination indispensable for success. Napoleon, James Watt, etc. How draw a dividing line so as to assign to the imagination only its rightful share? In addition, the anatomical determination is beset with difficulties. A method flourishing very greatly about the middle of the 19th century consisted of weighing carefully a large number of brains and drawing various conclusions as to the intellectual superiority or inferiority from a comparison of the weights. We find on this point numerous documents in the special works published during the period mentioned. But this method of weights has given rise to so many surprises and difficulties in the way of explanation that it has been quite necessary to give it up, since we see in it only another element of the problem. Nowadays we attribute the greatest importance to the morphology of the brain, to its histological structure, the marked development of certain regions, the determination not only of centers, but of connections and associations between centers. On this last point, contemporary anatomists have given themselves up to eager researches, and although the cerebral architecture is not conceived by all in the same way, it is proper for psychology to note that all, with their centers or associational system, try to translate into their own language the complex conditions of mental life. Since we must choose from among these various anatomical views, let us accept that of Flechsig, one of the most renowned and one having also the advantage of putting directly the problem of the organic conditions of the imagination. We know that Flechsig relies on the embryological method, that is, on the development, in the order of time, of nerves and centers. For him there exist on the one hand sensitive regions, sensory motory, occupying about a third of the cortical surface; on the other hand, association centers, occupying the remaining part. So far as the sensory centers are concerned, development occurs in the following order: organic sensations, middle of the cerebral cortex; smell, base of the brain and part of the frontal lobes; sight, occipital lobe; hearing, first temporal. Whence it results that in a definitive part of the brain the body comes to proper consciousness of its impulses, wants, appetites, pains, movements, etc., and that this part develops first, knowledge of the body precedes that of the outside world. In what concerns the associational centers, Flechsig supposes three regions: the great posterior center, parieto-occipital temporal, another much smaller, anterior or frontal, and a middle center, the smallest of all, the island of Reil. Comparative anatomy proves that the associational centers are more important than those of sensation. Among the lower mammals they develop as we go up the scale. That which makes the psychic man may be said to be the centers of association that he possesses. In the newborn child the sensitive centers are isolated, and in the absence of connections between them, the unity of the self cannot be manifested. There is a plurality of consciousness. This much admitted, let us return to our special question, which Flechsig asks in these words: On what does genius rest? Is it based on a special structure in the brain, or rather on special irritability? That is, according to our present notions, on chemical factors? We may hold the first opinion with all possible force. Genius is always united to a special structure, to a particular organization of the brain. All parts of this organ do not have the same value. It has been long admitted that the frontal part may serve as a measure of intellectual capacity, but we must allow, contrariwise, that there are other regions, principally a center located under the protuberance at the top of the head, which is very much developed in all men of genius whose brains have been studied down to our day. In Beethoven, and probably also in Bach, the enormous development of this part of the brain is striking. In great scientists like Gauss, the centers of the posterior region of the brain and those of the frontal region are strongly developed. The scientific genius thus shows proportions of brain structure other than the artistic genius. There would be then, according to our author, a preponderance of the frontal and parietal regions, the former obtained especially among artists, the latter among scientists. Already, 20 years before Flechsig, Rüdinger had noted the extraordinary development of the parietal convolutions in eminent men after a study of 18 brains. All the convolutions and fissures were so developed, said he, that the parietal occipital region had an altogether peculiar character. By way of summary, we must bear in mind that, as regards anatomical conditions, even when depending on the best of sources, we can at present give only fragmentary, incomplete, hypothetical views. Let us now go on to the physiology. 2. We might have rightly asked whether the physiological states existing along with the working of the creative imagination are the cause, effect, or merely the accompaniment of this activity. Probably all the three conditions are met with. First, concomitance is an accomplished fact, and we may consider it as an organic manifestation parallel to that of the mind. Again, the employment of artificial means to excite and maintain the effervescence of the imagination assigns a causal or antecedent position to the physiologic conditions. Lastly, the psychic activity may be initial and productive of changes in the organism, or, if these already exist, may augment and prolong them. The most instructive instances are those indicated by very clear manifestations and profound modifications of the bodily condition. Such are the moments of inspiration, or simply those of warmth from work which arise in the form of sudden impulses. The general fact of most importance consists of changes in the blood circulation. Increase of intellectual activity means an increase of work in the cortical cells, dependent on a congested, sometimes a temporary anemic state. Hyperemia seems rather the rule, but we also know that slight anemia increases cortical excitability. Weak, contracted pulse, pale, chilly skin, overheated head, brilliant, sunken, roving eyes. Such is the classic, frequently quoted description of the physiological state during creative labor. There are numerous inventors who, of their own accord, have noted these changes. Irregular pulse in the case of Lagrange, congestion of the head in Beethoven, who made use of cold douches to relieve it, etc. This elevation of the vital tone, this nervous tension, translates itself into motor form through movements analogous to reflexes, without special end, mechanically repeated and always the same in the same man. For example, movement of the feet, hands, fingers, whittling the table or the arms of a chair, as in the case of Napoleon when he was elaborating a plan of campaign, etc. It is a safety valve for the excessive flow of nervous impulse, and it is admitted that this method of expenditure is not useless for preserving the understanding in all its clearness. In a word, increase of the cerebral circulation is the formula covering the majority of observations on this subject. Does experimentation, strictly so called, teach us anything on this point? Numerous and well-known physiological researches, especially those of Mosso, show that all intellectual and most of all emotional work produces cerebral congestion, that the brain volume increases, and the volume of the peripheral organs diminishes. But that tells us nothing particularly about the imagination, which is but a special case under the rule. Latterly, indeed, it has been proposed to study inventors by an objective method through the examination of their several circulatory, respiratory, digestive apparatus, their general and special sensibility, the modes of their memory and forms of association, their intellectual processes, etc. But up to this time no conclusion has been drawn from these individual descriptions that would allow any generalization. Besides, has an experiment in the strict sense of the word ever been made at the physiological moment? I know of none. Would it be possible? Let us admit that by some happy chance the experimenter, using all his means of investigation, can have the subject under his hand at the exact moment of inspiration, of the sudden, fertile, brief creative impulse. Would not the experiment itself be a disturbing cause, so that the result would be ipso facto vitiated, or at least unconvincing? There still remains a mass of facts deserving summary notice, the oddities of inventors. Were we to collect only those that may be regarded as authentic, we might make a thick volume. Despite their anecdotal character, these evidences do not seem to be unworthy of some regard. It is impossible to enter here upon an enumeration that would be endless. After having collected for my own information a large number of these strange peculiarities, it seems to me that they are reducible to two categories. 1. Those inexplicable freaks dependent on the individual constitution, and more often, probably, also on experiences in life the memory of which has been lost. Schiller, for example, kept rotten apples in his work-desk. 2. The others, more numerous, are easy to explain. They are physiological means consciously or unconsciously chosen to aid creative work. They are auxiliary helpers of the imagination. The most frequent method consists of artificially increasing the flow of blood to the brain. Rousseau would think bareheaded in full sunshine. Bossuet would work in a cold room with his head wrapped in furs. Others would immerse their feet in ice-cold water. Grétry, Schiller. Very numerous are those who think horizontally, that is, lying stretched out and often flattened under their blankets. Milton, Descartes, Leibniz, Rossini, etc. Some require motor excitation, they work only when walking, or else prepare for work by physical exercise, Mozart. For variety's sake, let us note those who must have the noise of the streets, crowds, talk, festivities, in order to invent. For others there must be external pomp and a personal part in the scene, Machiavelli, Buffon. Guido Reni would paint only when dressed in magnificent style, his pupils crowded about him and attending to his wants in respectful silence. On the opposite side are those requiring retirement, silence, contemplation, even shadowy darkness, like Lamennais. In this class we find especially scientists and thinkers, Tycho Brahé, who for 21 years scarcely left his observatory, Leibniz, who could remain for 3 days almost motionless in an armchair. But most methods are too artificial or too strong not to become quickly noxious. Everyone knows what they are: abuse of wine, alcoholic liquors, narcotics, tobacco, coffee, etc., prolonged periods of wakefulness, less for increasing the time for work than to cause a state of hyperesthesia and a morbid sensibility. Goncourt. Summing up, the organic bases of the creative imagination, if there are any specially its own, remain to be determined. For in all that has been said, we have been concerned only with some conditions of the general working of the mind, assimilation as well as invention. The eccentricities of inventors studied carefully and in a detailed manner would finally, perhaps, be most instructive material, because it would allow us to penetrate into their inmost individuality. Thus the physiology of the imagination quickly becomes pathology. I shall not dwell on this, having purposely eliminated the morbid side of our subject. It will, however, be necessary to return thereto, touching upon it in another part of this essay. 3. There remains a problem, so obscure and enigmatic that I scarcely venture to approach it. in the analogy that most languages, the spontaneous expression of a common thought, establish between physiologic and psychic creation. Is it only a superficial likeness, a hasty judgment, a metaphor, or does it rest on some positive basis? Generally, the various manifestations of mental activity have as their precursor an unconscious form from which they arise. The sensitiveness belonging to living substance, known by the names heliotropism, chemotropism, etc., is like a sketch of sensation and of the reactions following it. Organic memory is the basis and the obliterated form of conscious memory. Reflexes introduce voluntary activity. Appetitions and hidden tendencies are the forerunners of affective psychology. Instinct, on several sides, is like an unconscious and specific trial of reason. Has the creative power of the human mind also analogous antecedents, a physiological equivalent? One metaphysician, Froschammer, who has elevated the creative imagination to the rank of primary world principle, asserts this positively. For him there is an objective or cosmic imagination working in nature, producing the innumerable varieties of vegetable and animal forms. Transformed into subjective imagination, it becomes in the human brain the source of a new form of creation. The very same principle causes the living forms to appear, a sort of objective image, and the subjective images, a kind of living form. However ingenious and attractive this philosophical theory may be, it is evidently of no positive value for psychology. Let us stick to experience. Physiology teaches that generation is a prolonged nutrition, a surplus, as we see so plainly in the lower forms of agamous generation, budding, division. The creative imagination likewise presupposes a superabundance of psychic life that might otherwise spend itself in another way. Generation in the physical order is a spontaneous natural tendency, although it may be stimulated, successfully or otherwise, by artificial means. We can say as much of the other. This list of resemblances it would be easy to prolong, but all this is insufficient for the establishment of a thorough identity between the two cases and the solution of the question. It is possible to limit it, to put it into more precise language. Is there a connection between the development of the generative function and that of the imagination? Even in this form, the question scarcely permits any but vague answers. In favor of a connection, we may allege: 1. The well-known influence of puberty on the imagination of both sexes, expressing itself in daydreams, in aspirations toward an unattainable ideal, in the genius for invention that love bestows upon the least favored. Let us recall also the mental troubles, the psychoses designated by the name hebephrenia. With adolescence coincides the first flowering of the fancy which, having emerged from its swaddling clothes of childhood, is not yet sophisticated and rationalized. It is not a matter of indifference for the general thesis of the present work to note that this development of the imagination depends wholly on the first effervescence of the emotional life. That influence of the feelings on the imagination, and of the imagination on the feelings, of which the moralist and the older psychologist speak so often, is a vague formula for expressing this fact, that the motor element included in the images is reinforced. 2. Per contra, the weakening of the generative power and of the constructive imagination coincide in old age, which is, in a word, a decay of nutrition, a progressive atrophy. It is proper not to omit the influence of castration. According to the theory of Brown-Séquard, it produces an abatement of the nutritive functions through the suppression of an internal stimulus, and although its relations to the imagination have not been especially studied, it is not rash to admit that it is an arresting cause. However, the foregoing merely establishes, between the functions compared, a concomitance in the general course of their evolution and in their critical periods. It is insufficient for a conclusion. There would be needed clear, authentic, and sufficiently numerous observations, proving that individuals bereft of imagination of the creative type have acquired it suddenly through the sole fact of their sexual influences, and inversely, that brilliant imaginations have faded under the contrary conditions. We find some of these evidences in Cavigny, Moreau de Tours, and various alienists. They would seem to be in favor of the affirmative, but some seem to be not sure enough, others not explicit enough. Despite my investigations on this point, and inquiry of competent persons, I do not venture to draw a definite conclusion. I leave the question open. It will perhaps tempt another, more fortunate investigator. End of first part, chapter 4.